So, Matt Walsh, only a few days ago, sat down with this channel called Breaking Points, where he was confronted on Laura Loomer, the Haitian migrant nonsense, racism, and a whole lot more. So, let's buckle in and brace ourselves. I've not yet seen this, so we don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if Matt Walsh is going to lose or not. Then again, the audience is probably going to lose first and foremost because we're watching Matt Walsh, but that's just how these things go.
We are joined now by Matt Walsh, who is out with a new movie called Am I Racist? That is in theaters around the country. Matt obviously hosts his eponymous show with the Daily Wire. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah, now the movie's doing pretty well. I don't know if it was a coincidence or fate, whatever it was, as it happened, when your movie was released last week, everyone was debating whether a very particular post on social media was racist. So we thought we would play a little game of was it racist? With Laura Loomer's infamous curry tweet. If Kamala Harris wins, the White House will smell like curry and White House speeches will be facilitated by a call center. The American people will only be able to convey their feedback through a customer satisfaction survey at the end of the call that nobody will understand. One of the interesting things about your movie, which I really enjoyed, Ryan might have something to add on that, we might disagree on it, I really enjoyed it, is getting to the bottom of the the industrial complex that's been built up around race relations that often will advance this silly, incoherent, elite definition that used to be prolific in academia and then leaked out into the rest of the world. So by the sort of definition of racism that you're challenging in this film, is that Laura Loomer tweet racist?
Yeah, that's fucking obvious. If you say that if Kamala wins, the White House will smell like curry, like an ode to the fact that she's Indian American, yes, that's fucking racist. That's like saying, if we elected Barack Obama, the White House will be run like a gang. Let's hear what Matt Walsh is going to say, though.
And then by the kind of definition that you're trying to promote of racism, which maybe you have a way to explain it, I would define, I don't want to put words in your mouth, as just sort of like genuine discrimination based on this belief that people of a different race are somehow inferior. Yeah. Is this post-racist?
I mean, by the definition advanced by the DEI industry, it certainly would count as racist.
Right.
I wouldn't call it race. I think it's just kind of a dumb joke. Not very helpful joke. And also, by the way, I like Indian food. So I think when things smell like curry, I'm a huge fan of curry, personally. So I don't see that as an insult. But look, someone engaging in stereotypes, it might be insensitive, it might be unhelpful politically, but it's not necessarily racist. In fact, I would say it's often not racist because...
What? If the stereotype is based on a racial stereotype, then yeah, that would be racist. Stereotyping can be racist when somebody tries to enforce those stereotypes. So saying, hey, here's a stereotype that Indian people are going to smell like curry. I am going to enforce this stereotype by telling everybody, if Kamala Harris wins, this stereotype will become true. That is a racial stereotype.
To me, what racism means is that you hate people of another race and or you think they're inferior to you in some way. Inherently, because...
So why does it have to be you hate somebody from another race? You could think somebody's inferior to you and not hate them, you know? I think that insects are inferior to me, but I don't hate insects. Not to mention I'm seeing people in chat bring up that Matt Walsh himself was whining about the white guy taco joke that Tim Walz made not too long ago. So now we got to pull that up for a little bit of context.
Like I have white guy tacos and
what is
like
that,
black,
like mayonnaise and tuna? What are you doing?
pretty much ground beef and cheese.
That's
and
okay. Do you put any flavor in it?
No.
Oh.
Here's the deal. No, they said to be careful and let her know this, that black pepper is the top of the spice level in Minnesota, you know.
I'm the first vice president, I believe, who has ever grown chili peppers.
I'm trying to expand my food knowledge.
You know, we've got some cantaloupes. You'll be fine.
Yeah.
So that he's claiming is racist. He's not making other stereotypes about other white people even necessarily. Tim Walz makes an actual funny joke about himself. How like, yeah, for white guys like me, I can only get this spicy, haha. But then when Laura Loomer says if Kamala Harris wins, the whole place is going to smell like curry, Matt Walsh is saying that's not racist.
Okay, so now most people seem to be focused on the fact that this is so awkward and fake and lame, but everyone's skipping over the more important point, which is that a presidential candidate just casually dropped anti-white racism in the middle of what was supposed to be a light-hearted video. Tim Walz says that he makes white guy tacos. and Kamala says, what is that, mayonnaise and tuna? Like, that is anti-white racism.
That's actually kind of a funny joke. If you're going to say the smells like curry thing was just a joke, but this, for you, is where you draw the line, making a joke about white people eating mayonnaise, really? That's just too far for you? So now we've also established that Matt Walsh is completely inconsistent. If Matt Walsh is going to say furthering any kind of racial stereotype, no matter what, doesn't matter, that's racist, fine. Then he would need to conclude that if what Tim Walz said about himself is racist, then also what Laura Loomer said about other people would also therefore be racist. But somehow Matt is inconsistent. It seems as though he has a really big issue when there's even the slightest whiff of interpreted possible racism against white people, but then he is completely nose blind when it comes to racism against all other people.
You might have stereotypical views about another group of people. Everybody does. But it's not automatically racist if you don't also harbor that ill will towards them. And as far as whether or not, so the real answer is that with the Laura Loomer tweet, I wouldn't say that it's racist. The only person who can answer whether it's racist is her. We'd have to ask her, well, do you hate people of Indian descent? Do you think that they're inferior?
So basically his definition of racism is so fucking comical that you would never actually be able to confirm anything ever. Hey, when you made this tweet, were you typing it out while having seething hatred and contempt in your heart for black people? No? Okay, well, I guess she's not racist. Listen, the argument shouldn't even be, is this person racist or not? Because if you want to take the very literal approach that to be racist means you harbor actual hatred or disdain for another race and all this, fine. But you can never prove that. You can never prove what's in somebody's heart. So what Matt Walsh is doing here is, by establishing his definition of racism, meaning that the person themselves must feel that hatred, that makes it impossible to ever confirm whether or not somebody's racist. So you're wasting time having this conversation with Matt Walsh. Instead of that, it shouldn't be, was this racist? Is this person racist? As a character flaw. Instead, it should be, was what this person said racist? So no, it doesn't matter what somebody even believes in their heart, even if they believe the opposite of what they're posting. If you're putting racist remarks out there, that's doing a general harm and it's furthering stereotypes. I don't care if you yourself are racist or not. I don't care about the intentions of your actions. I care about the results of your actions.
If the answer is yes, then yeah, that's racist. But she'd probably say no. And if she said no, then I'll have to take her word for it. She's the only one who can speak to her own, what's going on in her own mind and her own heart.
Although she's a Trump supporter, she wants Kamala to lose. Presumably, she's making the point in a negative way,
Well,
right?
it's
Like,
also-
this is a bad thing.
that's
Like
kind of-
Paul Center and, like, she's saying these are all bad things.
This
right?
is an interesting point about
So that would,
stereotypes.
by your definition.
Thank you. Yes, that guy's correct as well. Like, she's obviously a big Trump supporter, so clearly this tweet that was racist was intended to be negative.
Make it.
Because stereotyping is often leveraged to say that there's something negative that is generally attributed to someone of a different race.
Right, it's correct. It's negative. She means it in a negative way. Because we can assume that she thinks
So
things smell.
how is furthering a negative stereotype based on someone's race not racist? So now he can basically get away with saying nobody's ever been racist. What if the KKK, while they were lynching black people, were inside feeling kind of bad about it and they didn't really like it, Was what they did racist? Yes, it's still racist. The actions, the results of your actions were racist. So I don't give a shit.
I guess not a fan of Indian food, but you can believe or engage in or repeat negative stereotypes and not be racist. You might just happen to think. So, for example, I'll give another example. Somebody might say, Asians are bad drivers. I don't know if that's actually true statistically. I'm not sure. But if you happen to believe that it's true, does that mean that you hate Asians? No, it just means that you think that Asians, by and large, are bad drivers. It doesn't mean you hate them.
Yeah, but it means that you harbor a negative view of somebody, or you harbor a negative view of an entire race. This is obviously going to play out with actions that are racist.
Although it could mean that you think there's like an intellectual inferiority, or it could mean you think there's a cultural reason that they're bad at driving in Western countries.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, and no one thinks that Asians are intellectually inferior. I think everybody understands that that's one of the other, because stereotypes can be positive too. Another stereotype is that they're very good at math and science and that sort of thing. So, there are generalizations you can make about groups of people that can be largely true. And, I'm not sure I've ever heard a stereotype where I thought to myself, well, that bears no resemblance to reality. I don't know, unless one of you can think of, I've never heard of a stereotype where I said, I don't even know where that comes from. That's just falling out of the sky. Usually stereotypes arise because, society has observed things about groups of people.
Oh, okay, Matt. Well, if that's the case, then why are you saying that Tim Walz making a little joke about mayonnaise and white guy tacos is racist? I mean, if you're saying that stereotypes have a bit of truth behind them and that's somehow a justification or defense, well, okay. Do you think there's ever something or some kind of common theme with white people not really liking spicy food or not really putting a lot of seasoning on their food? You don't think that's ever been a thing observed? Like, how can you say, for one thing, for the Laura Loomer shit about the White House smelling like curry, you're like, well, sometimes generalizations have a bit of truth behind them, haha. But then when it comes to Tim Walz joking about himself, saying that, oh, I like white guy tacos, that's racist?
And they can be negative, they can be positive, but I don't see them as inherently racist.
I would say that if you're generalizing an entire group of people based on the color of their skin and coming to some kind of conclusion about their behavior, that would obviously be a racist generalization.
I think we have a lot less of it than pretty much anywhere else on Earth. But whatever racism you find in society now is individual. It's not systemic. It's not in the system. These systems are not set up to disadvantage quote-unquote people of color. In fact, the only real systemic racism you find anymore is the kind that's targeted at white people and also Asians. That's what affirmative action is. Like that, the only time you ever find a policy...
Affirmative action, they're so confused about what that is. Affirmative action is literally just making opportunities more available to other communities. It's not just like giving jobs to black people and telling all white people to go to hell.
that specifically says, here's an
Also, there is systemic racism when we have black people disproportionately given the death sentence, black people disproportionately living in poverty. We have a massive wealth gap compared to white people and black people. We still are seeing the effects of racist policies of the past, like redlining. We're still seeing the black community struggle. So no, there's a whole fuck ton of issues involving systemic racism and the way that racist policies of the past are still currently negatively impacting the black community today. That is still happening, and it needs to still be talked about. Matt Walsh just denying this, it's not convincing anybody.
Advantage that you can't have if you're a race. The only time it ever says that is if it's singling out white and or Asian people. It doesn't go the other way anymore.
Well, so what about, and even people on the right now are saying Republicans have singled out Haitians, and this is an interesting segue because we were just talking about multiculturalism and how wherever you have different people from different backgrounds, races, ethnicities put together, there will always be some types of discrimination, and the goal of the culture should be to minimize that. Has there been legitimate racism directed by high-profile Republican lawmakers? This is the accusation on the table towards the Haitian community in the United States, and particularly in Springfield, Ohio, in the last couple of weeks.
No, absolutely not. I haven't heard it. Everything I've heard has been critical of the fact that we're importing thousands of people from the third world.
We're not importing thousands of people from the third world. Again, that makes it sound as if the government is somehow involved in scooping up a bunch of people and sticking them here. We saw how Haitians gradually moved over to Springfield, Ohio because of the opportunities. And we're also seeing how that town was previously dying and is now starting to be revitalized as a result of the new workforce.
Who are coming into communities. And look, America... Nobody thinks that it will benefit America to become more like Haiti. Nobody thinks that. Or I would challenge anyone, if they do think that, to explain how that's the case. Like, in what way?
Nobody says this. What the fuck is this argument? No one's saying, if only America was more like Haiti, then everything would be great. What? You realize that immigrants assimilate to the general population at much greater rates as opposed to rejection of assimilation, right? You realize that immigrants will usually begin to conform more and more to the general public the longer that they're in this country.
Let them take care of themselves and their own problems. I'm also not saying that there's like never a scenario where we let someone from Haiti into the country. But it doesn't have to just be about Haiti, but when you're throwing open the gates and just inviting anyone, in particular, the third world.
I guess your assumption there
You're not inviting just anybody. Again, the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio are largely legally there through a federal program. And also, in the month of July, even though there were 56,000 border apprehensions, Haitian immigrants only made up 92 of those apprehensions. Haitian immigrants are not just flooding the country illegally. They're here in Springfield, Ohio, through a government program, and they're here legally. So he's just making shit up.
it is the Haitian people that are creating the conditions on Haiti, and that if the Haitian people come to Springfield, they will recreate the conditions
Well, but I don't
that
think
are
you
in Haiti
can-
in Springfield, whereas what I'm saying is that it's actually the U.S. that is
I don't think you can entirely put
like,
it on.
largely,
But it's still a country comprised of people, right?
but
And-
without its own autonomy. As
Okay,
a,
but you can't. I don't think you can entirely put it on the United States. Like the Haitian people have nothing to do whatsoever with the state of their own country. Nothing. I mean, I think that's a bit absurd. I'm perfectly willing to, as I said, agree that a lot of the United States sort of adventurism and interventions in other countries has been unwise, and I prefer for us to focus on our own country, not try to build governments in other countries. But at the same time, I think that you can't completely absolve.
Why even bother arguing this point then? Just move on. Just be like, oh, okay, well, thanks for letting me know. I'm not really super educated when it comes to foreign affairs. Anyway, and then just move on to your next point.
People of any country are the problem, just like in this country. The problems that we have in our country, we can point to the government, we can point to immigration, we can point to all those things. But ultimately, like the people of the country have to be responsible
Right.
for their own nation. And I say that of all nations.
right, fair enough. So you said earlier that we have less racism here than lots of other countries, which I think is a fair point to make.
Glass half full.
And obviously, you would acknowledge that at some point in our history, we had lots of racism, right?
Sure.
Lots of racism then, less racism now. So when did we get to a point where it wasn't systemic and it was no longer a problem? That
Such a good question right there. I love that question. Another really good way to frame this question is just first ask them and get them to concede that history has consequences. Because anybody that denies that would be obviously living in delusion. Obviously, history has consequences. So if historically there was racial discrimination, then the consequences of that are still being felt today.
we as a democratic society need to deal with. Like, what was the moment in your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that you could point to one exact moment in time when it goes from a systemic issue to not systemic anymore. But what we know for sure is that right now we are certainly in the moment where it's not systemic. Any time in history, I'll answer your question.
Yeah.
At any point in history, when you can go back and look at actual laws and policies that were in place that deprived Black Americans or any other group of rights, well, that was a time when you had systemic, and we know that that existed historically.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to point to an exact moment, I mean, I guess the most obvious moment would be the Civil Rights Act. But of course, these are changes that happen gradually over time.
So again, he's taking the approach that systemic racism must therefore be on the law, like on the law books. It must say like, a white man is worth more than a black man here in the United States. That's not what systemic racism means anymore. What systemic racism looks like, again, are the consequences of historical actions. So, because the Black community was historically targeted and kept down via redlining and other discriminatory practices, that led to Black people disproportionately being unable to accumulate wealth. And now, to this very day, we still see higher rates of Black people living in poverty and and a large wealth gap between white people and Black people.
Just like with slavery, you can't, even with slavery, you can't really, people like to point to the Emancipation Proclamation as the moment when slavery was ended. Of course, we know that wasn't when it ended. So we know we don't have slavery anymore, but if you were to ask me, what's the exact moment when slavery stopped? Well, it wasn't an exact moment. It was a gradual ending of that horrific institution. But certainly now it doesn't exist anymore, in this country anyway. And I'd say the same thing with systemic racism as well, that nobody is creating policy.
There is also systemic racism when it comes to hiring practices. So if you have a Black-sounding name, you're less likely to get hired. Criminal justice system is another big one. Black people are disproportionately given the death sentence, partially because Black people are disproportionately living in poverty, which means that they're disproportionately unable to afford a proper defender, etc. And it just leads to all kinds of, yes, systemic problems.
Policies, again, that are deliberately intended to create disadvantages for quote-unquote people of color.
I have a question about that. A lot of conservatives will say there is one policy, and this is, you're about as anti-abortion and pro-life as it gets. A lot of conservatives will say a remaining institution of systemic racism is abortion because it disproportionately, as conservatives make this argument, affects Black children and Black families. Is that an example of systemic racism?
Oh, that's such a good question, though, using his playbook here. So is abortion systemic racism then? Another really good one, too, is the welfare stuff. Conservatives love to point at the welfare policies and whatnot that negatively impacted the Black community, but then they'll simultaneously turn around and say systemic racism isn't a thing. Systemic racism doesn't have to hold with it the intent to discriminate. Systemic racism is the result of the system. So if you have a welfare state, even if your intention is to benefit this community and it ends up negatively, disproportionately affecting that community, that is systemic racism. Intent doesn't matter.
No,
Racism or racism, period.
And I think it's a mistake when conservatives make that point, because I think conservatives are very desperate to be able to do the whole thing where they turn back on Democrats and say the Dems are the real racists.
Yes.
And I just think that's a lame move, and you're trying to use the left's own language against it, which I think it doesn't work because you're accepting sort of their premise. So what I'd say about abortion is, no, it's not systemically racist. It does disproportionately impact the black community, no question about it. But does it exist for that? Really, is Planned Parenthood? Is that why they exist right now? Because they want to kill?
He's so hung up on intent, and he does not fucking understand that systemic racism does not need to hold with it intent.
Black babies. No, Planned Parenthood exists because they want to kill babies, and they don't care what color the baby is. They just want the money that comes from it. But it just so happens that that ends up disproportionately impacting the black community. And this goes to the disproportionate impact thing, which I'm glad you brought that up, because that's usually what's used to support the theory of systemic racism. Is they say, well, but these policies disproportionately impact certain groups. Again,
That's what I was just saying. So what's his response now?
they might, but that doesn't mean that they're intended to do that. Just
Okay, so again, we're back to the intent. So he's literally acknowledging systemic racism. He's acknowledging that there are policies that disproportionately negatively impact people of color. But then he's saying, well, because the intent wasn't to hurt anybody, therefore it's not systemic racism.
a disproportionate number of black Americans end up in prison. Does that mean that that's why the prison is there to put black Americans in it? No. The reason why a disproportionate number of black
if you want to look at intent about the prison complex and the war on drugs, there was an intent behind the war on drugs to criminalize black people. That was actually made known. That's been made public now. So him bringing up the prison thing is actually a little bit yikesy for him and shows how weak his argumentation really is, because there are a disproportionate rate of black people in prison right now, partially because of the war on drugs, which Nixon perpetuated so that they could systematically discriminate against black people.
Americans end up in prison is that, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of black Americans commit violent crime. That's just what the stats show. And
so there's an argument that a system is what it does. And that...
Again, why do they commit greater rates of violent crime? Is it because of poverty? If there is a disproportionate group, or if black people are disproportionately in poverty, you will then see disproportionate rates of crime. Crime follows poverty. That's an economic fact. It's just what happens. You reduce poverty, you reduce crime.
Claiming otherwise is just kind of hocus pocus, just magic. Like if a system produces a certain result, but you as an observer of that system say, well, actually, that's not what the system is supposed to do. Those words are just meaningless.
What about
and
a
that
system?
The system just chews them up and spits them out and produces and continues to produce the result that it produces. Like, for instance, during Jim Crow, pre-Civil Rights Act, you've got laws on the books that are systemically racist, that allow for straight up racist results. When it comes
Design
to
of the system was explicitly racist.
Design of the system is aimed at producing segregated schools and low-income households. Low-income neighborhoods that are predominantly or almost exclusively populated by black Americans, right? Mm-hmm. You then pass laws that reform those laws, that make it so that you can't legally do those things anymore. Yet the power structure broadly remains in place, and the results stay the same. You still have, broadly speaking, massive low-income areas, predominantly populated by black families, and you continue to have segregated schools. And so a person who was born into this country today, if they're black, they're more likely to grow up in one of those neighborhoods. They're more likely to go to terrible schools rather than good schools. They're more likely to end up in prison or in part of the system. And so you would step back and say, well, the system is still doing what it is. The system never stopped doing it. There was never a day from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday that all of a sudden the system stopped working in the same racist way, which we acknowledge was racist when it was written into the
I kind of like his argument here.
law.
Although the system
But now
produces...
we pretend it's not because we struck through that one law.
yeah, but if we agree that you say the system is what it does, I'd probably disagree with you on that. What the system is intended to do is what it certainly matters here.
But why?
But also,
why would it matter?
Why does that matter?
What we intend a system to do. Like if,
Because
if I,
that's what
if
we're
I
talking
build, if I
The
build
system
a,
produces a
yeah.
robust Nigerian middle class, like people who come here from Nigeria. Tom Sowell makes this point. It's a point that's popular.
So then that's a
right?
defense of the system.
That's what I'm
because
saying.
that's what it does.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So does that go both ways?
No, because the intent of this. My point is that the intent, whatever you intend a system to do, is meaningless. Like if you intend.
Thank you. Thank you. That's exactly correct. Just like what I brought up about welfare. If you intend this policy to benefit the black community, but it ends up negatively impacting the black community, it's still systemic racism.
For a house to have a roof and a second floor that is sturdy. But when you walk into the second floor, you fall through it.
But that
and the
doesn't
roof
reflect
collapses on you.
But that doesn't reflect on your anti-roof sentiments.
Yeah, and also
It doesn't matter.
And also,
Built-
if you
built a
okay, but to
crappy
use your
house.
analogy, if you walk into a house and there's a problem in the house, you can't automatically assume that it's the fault of whoever built the house. It could be, depending on the problem. But you also have to look at who's living in the house, who's supposed to be maintaining the house. And if you're living in a house and you're not taking care of it, and in fact you're mistreating the house, and it goes to hell, and then you turn around and blame whoever built the house 100 years ago. Well, I'm going to say, like, well, this is at some point you got to take responsibility for your own house, and so that's
Aha. So the very classic argument that actually has exposed Matt Walsh. It answers the question, ladies and gentlemen. Is Matt Walsh racist? Yes. Because what he's saying now is that there's no systemic racism. Black people are just disproportionately living in poverty and disproportionately commit more crime because they're black, or just because they're somehow inferior. Because you're ignoring the systemic context. You're ignoring the fact that for somebody in that community, if they wanted to get out of that community, get out of that poor area, first they need a job. Well, that area is poor, so there's not a lot of access to jobs. Second of all, if you have a black sounding name, you're less likely to be hired. Third of all, if you're living in a poor area, you're also going to a shitty school. Now you have a worse education, lowering your chances of getting a good job. The list goes on, and it continues to snowball out of control. There are systemic issues still plaguing the black community, and when you ignore it the way that Matt Walsh is, all you're concluding is that black people are just stupid, I guess.
my point with the black community as it stands right now in America. Yes, as we've already established, there was actual systemic racism against the black community for a long time. It's a terrible, evil thing. Everybody agrees on that point. I don't think anyone disagrees. That is over now. There is no longer a system in place that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights. I mean, would you agree with that at least?
No, I do think it's still designed that way, but it's designed in a way where it can't be litigated because it's not in the law.
Okay, but so can you point to me an exact point of the system, an exact place in the system, a policy that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights?
The
The
same.
war on drugs. The war on drugs. Oh, bring up the war on drugs, please. You literally have the design of that system. You even have the intent behind that system. And yes, it was to criminalize black people.
People that designed the system to protect the wealth of the upper class, in the 40, throughout American history, like continued to be in
Yeah,
control.
but now you're talking about class, not race. I'm talking about race.
Right, but how do you disrupt class if you're so segregated by? I mean, how do you disrupt race if you're so segregated by class?
Well, but I don't think you can bring class into this because I would agree that we could talk about class. I'll agree that there are elites who care about themselves and don't care about the lower class. I would say that those people are just as unconcerned with a white person in a trailer park in Appalachia as they are unconcerned with a black person in the inner city. So it is class. We could talk about that. But my question was,
Yeah, but it is class, but there's also another component here, which is context. Why is there a poor white person living out in a trailer in the mountains of Appalachia versus black people disproportionately living in poverty? What are the reasons why? What is the context behind? There has been historical discrimination targeted at black people intended to keep them down, and we're still dealing with the results of that to this very day. You don't have the same thing with white people. Of course, some white people are poor. Of course. If a white person is poor, living in poverty, odds are they are not living in poverty because they are discriminated against for being white. But if you're a black person living in poverty with your whole family who's been living in poverty, there's a good chance the reason for that is because of historical racist policies that, yes, targeted you.
because we talk about the system, it's a broad concept here. So let's narrow it down. Let's find a piece of the system that we can point to and say, well, this is designed to hurt black people.
Okay, so if you go to Georgia, for instance, after they implemented school desegregation, what they started doing is saying, oh, okay, well, we can't legally keep black people out of our neighborhoods or out of our schools. But what we can do is we can secede from our neighborhoods. You've been to the Atlanta suburbs?
A little bit.
Like every four,
Unfortunately.
like every four,
Try to stay away.
like every 4 blocks for for a long time, you had like new school districts, and they would be drawn. They would be just basically gerrymandered. Like they would know where the white people were, and they would gerrymander the school district so that only white people would be a part of
Yeah,
this.
but you're going back to desegregation. I'm saying right now.
This is what they're doing now. Like this is up to today. Like so, what they're doing is they're saying,
no.
okay, these are the new laws in place. However, we like our system of segregation and racism that we have here. So how do we hire the best lawyers
Is that about class?
to show that? But it's also about race.
Well, but I'm saying, do you think primarily in the minds of the designers of the system, are they actually discriminating intentionally on
I
a
think
class basis,
they're
or is
pretty
it?
pretty race driven.
I don't think that there's any evidence that it's
This is
race. I think in like an example you give, it's class.
There's just no evidence. And then he's saying it's class. Class and race have significant overlaps, you idiot.
It's class. It's people wanting to avoid crime-ridden, impoverished areas. Not maybe
Why are they crime-ridden and impoverished, Matt?
someone doesn't want to send their kids to school in a place that's high crime and there's going to be a lot of delinquency and everything in the school system. I don't think it's because the kids are black. It's just because of that. And also, the other thing is when we talk about
Okay, well, if it's about class and not race, then why are you not more in favor of boosting some funding for those areas?
it's like when we talk about school districts or the way communities are set up, here's another point that rarely comes up. It's pretty simple. You can move, right? So you can always move. I mean, if you live in a community where you're claiming it's been set up systemically to disadvantage it, I don't buy that. But if I did, I would say, well, you should probably move from that community. I mean, you can go somewhere else. It's not.
What? You just said it's an impoverished, crime-ridden area. If it's impoverished, they probably don't have the funds to just move. Yeah, because poor people can just pack their bags and move. You know what? Homeless people, why don't they just start moving into a home? Seriously, what the fuck is their problem, you know?
There's no law saying you can't. And if there was, if there was a law saying,
Some HOA situations will like try to.
yeah, but they're not going to say you can't move here if you're black.
It's also why a lot of black community groups support voucher systems to allow, like, work with conservatives on voucher systems to allow.
I like how they gave him a solid example of systemic racism still happening to this day, and Matt said, I don't buy it.
to get to different schools.
So when you see stats that say like a black homeowner who's trying to get a mortgage, who has a higher credit score and higher income, gets a higher interest rate from the average bank than a white applicant. A bunch of these studies have been done where they'll put in like a black sounding name and higher credit scores, higher income, better candidates on paper other than their name, and they get overall, there have been so many studies that have replicated this. They get a higher interest rate, which means their cost of borrowing is higher, means the mortgage is higher, which means you have to have that much more, money to move into the neighborhood that you're talking about. So systemically, it doesn't say, well, if you're black, you can't live here, but systemically what it does is it makes it easier for white people to move into these wealthier neighborhoods, harder for black people to move into those neighborhoods. And that's before you even get to the wealth effect. Jim Crow only ended recently, which means that if you look at the kind of savings rates and the inheritance rates for the average black family, it's close to nil, especially after the subprime mortgage wipeout of 2008, compared to white families, which can go to mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and say, can you help put my kids in private school? Can you pay the down payment? 20% is an awful lot for this mortgage.
Generational wealth.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. Black people really missed out on accumulating generational wealth.
Combine the fact that they have to pay higher interest rates with the fact that there's lack of generational wealth. That to me is systemic. But I'm curious specifically on the interest rate question. What's going on there? And should that be a problem that we as a democratic society should address? Like, why are black loan applicants paying higher mortgage interest rates across the board?
So for the sake of argument, let's say that those studies are totally legit. I would still go back to a class issue on that. And the reason is that, look, banks...
But the white...
If it's a class issue, why do you have disproportionate rate of black people in a lower class and a disproportionate rate of white people in a higher class? Even if it was a class issue, it's being acted out on racial grounds. So it comes off as if it's racist. Yes, if black people are denied mortgages at higher rates compared to white people, that seems really weird. Even if their intention isn't to discriminate, the results of whatever is happening here throughout this process is that black people are being disproportionately discriminated against.
Like, banks banks care about the money. That's all they care about. They don't care about, I mean, these banks are not being run by people who are saying, we got to keep black people poor. They don't care about that.
Dude, one bank, wasn't there a bank in 2015 that literally just faced a fucking lawsuit for still using redlined maps? 5 days ago, a New Jersey bank is to pay $15 million in a redlining settlement. The complaint alleges that from 2018 through at least 2022, Ocean First failed to provide mortgage lending services to predominantly Black, Hispanic, and Asian neighborhoods in Middlesex, Monmouth, and Ocean counties in New Jersey by acquiring and then closing branches and loan production offices in the neighborhood. Bank to pay $31 million in a redlining settlement, DOJ's largest ever. It's a Los Angeles-based City National Bank. It was accused of discrimination by refusing to underwrite mortgages in predominantly Black and Latino communities, requiring the bank to pay more than $31 million in the largest redlining settlement in department history. And this was last fucking year. And Matt Walsh is saying like, well, that's not happening nowadays. The banks just care about the money, herder. No, banks do care about the money. They also care about the risk involved in their investment and whatnot. So if you have Black people and they're looking at Black people and deciding that because they're Black, they're probably poor and thus less likely to be able to pay the mortgage, etc., so they don't feel secure loaning to this person, the result of that is discrimination.
If that's happening, they're making stereotypical assumptions, class-based assumptions that I believe they would probably also make if somehow they got they had the impression that this was, say, a quote-unquote white trash, as they're often called, from the trailer park. If I think the banks would have the same sort of skeptical, discriminatory attitude.
Yeah, but they're not talking about just like random people. Like, here's a Black guy who's really poor and he didn't get a mortgage while this billionaire did. Huh? Racism. No, that's not obviously what's happening. They literally gave you the example of white and Black people who had the same fucking credit score, and the Black people were still given higher interest.
In that case, as they would to someone who they're assuming is from the inner city, let's say.
Right, but so the other word for that would be implicit bias. So let's say the banks.
We have to wrap, by the way. We have a hard note.
Oh, but let's say we got to wrap in a second. But let's say the banks only do care about money. That's a reasonable thing to say. So then, what could explain?
So if the bank only cares about money and in doing so views Black people as less trustworthy with their money, even if it was only a class thing first, it's now a racial issue. And now you have a system of discrimination at play.
Why they would treat the two differently? It would have to be, like you're saying, but what you're saying is there might be some implicit bias toward if they could identify some poor white guy, which goes to the point, though, of how it's easier for poor whites, which I was one.
Yeah, exactly. See, that literally plays to, if they're assuming that, that means that they're just assuming the Black person is poor, and they're not making the same assumption about white people. That's now a race problem, because you're applying class status to people on a racial basis. Oh my God, Matt Walsh is so stupid.
To be one of, but it was easier for me to migrate out. My name is Ryan Gray.
I don't even think
you can't even tell that I was white trash.
Right.
I mean, you can if you know me pretty well, but but you can't tell on a resume or an application.
You see his
to a
arrest
bank.
record.
Yes.
I don't know, you're wearing a tie and everything. I wouldn't say. I mean,
There you go.
It could have fooled me.
Yeah.
Look, but I wouldn't even call it implicit bias. I think it's just like banks. They are biased against people they don't think will pay their mortgage, basically.
Right. And so why don't
Yeah,
they
and why does the bank not think that Black people can pay their mortgages even though they have decent credit scores?
think a person with a Black name will pay their mortgage?
Because I think in that case,
despite a high credit score and high income.
if that is true, then they're making assumptions about, they're making class-based assumptions. This is a lower income person coming from a low income neighborhood.
How are they making class-based assumptions if they're looking at the thing that literally shows that they're making a lot of money and have a high credit score?
That's the background, and so
Sounds like those people face a systemic problem.
Well, class-based, but that's what I'm talking about.
People, even though they're making the same amount of money and have high credit scores, because they're Black or have a Black-sounding name, they are assumed to be poor with money. But systemic racism isn't a thing, guys. It's about class. Even though we know what this person's class status is, and we're still assuming they're bad with money based solely on their skin color. Matt Walsh got confronted and did not do very well at all. He also melted my fucking brain. Oh my God. If you want to support the channel, please consider becoming a member today. Members get early access to videos, access to all the stream VODs, and exclusive access to emotes as well. So if you'd like to support the channel, become a member today.